The doors of the great chamber closed behind me, with a sound like a held breath finally released. I stood alone on a circular platform of black stone, and above me, in tiered rows that curved into the shadows of a ceiling I could not see, sat every species that mattered in this part of the galaxy. 17 delegations. 17 sets of eyes, or sensors, or whatever each of them used to see, all fixed on me. My name is Ethan Cole. 6 months ago I was a surveyor, mapping quiet stars for a company that no longer exists in any form I recognize. Today I was something else entirely. I was the only human ever permitted inside the Galactic Council. I was also, according to the agenda glowing on the crystal panel beside the podium, the subject of the very first item to be discussed. Containment review. Species. Human. Status. Pending. I did not know exactly what containment meant here, but I understood the shape of the word well enough. It meant a cage with a polite name. The Vasron ambassador sat closest to me, elevated on a shelf of pale stone, his long face unreadable to me, in the way that all new things are unreadable at first. His mandibles clicked together, a small dry sound that carried strangely well in that enormous room. I would learn later that the click was something like a sigh. In that moment it simply sounded like judgment. "Human," he said, and the translator implant behind my ear turned his clicks into flat, careful words. "You stand before the council, not as a representative of your people, but as a witness. Do you understand this distinction?" "I understand it," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Good. Then you will also understand that what happens here today is not about you. It is about your species. Humanity has existed within known space for 11 of your years. In that time, there have been 4 violent encounters between humans and other species. 4. In 11 years. Compare this to any other race in this chamber, and you will find the number remarkable." I said nothing. There was nothing yet to say. He had not asked a question. Beside him, on a lower shelf of dark, oily stone, sat a delegate from a species I had not yet learned to name. Its body was long and layered, like something built from stacked shields, and it did not look at me so much as it looked through me, the way you might look through a window at weather you already expected. This, I would soon learn, was Threx, ambassador of the Krill. I felt his attention on me long before anyone said his name. There was a stillness to him that other species did not have. The Vasron shifted in their seats. The small floating delegates from the Olin cluster rippled with constant, nervous motion. But Threx did not move at all. He watched me the way a man might watch a fire he had already decided would burn out on its own. 6 months ago, the Vasron ambassador continued, a human survey vessel called the Kestrel was found adrift near the edge of neutral space. Its crew of 11 was reduced to 1 survivor, you. He did not phrase it as a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes," I said. "The Council has reviewed the wreckage. The Council has reviewed the logs. Today, the Council will determine what this incident means for the future of your species within galactic society. You have been brought here to observe that determination, and, if the chair permits, to respond to it." I looked past him, past the endless rows of alien faces, toward a section near the very top of the chamber where a single flag hung, faded and unfamiliar, marking a section reserved for observers, with no vote and no standing. That was where humanity sat in this room, not among equals, above the observers, but below everyone who actually mattered. I thought about Grace Miller, who used to hum old songs while she calibrated the long-range scanners. I thought about Peter Lang, who kept a small potted plant in his cabin because he said a ship without something green in it wasn't really a home. I thought about Olivia Brooks, who taught me how to read star charts the old way, with pen and paper, because she said machines should never be the only thing standing between you and understanding your own position in the universe. None of them were standing behind me now. I really was alone. A soft chime rang through the chamber, and the Vasron ambassador lifted one long hand toward a floating screen that unfolded itself in the center of the room, wide and bright enough for every delegate to see clearly. "Before we proceed to testimony," he said, "the Council will review the recovered flight recorder from the Kestrel. This recording has already been examined by Council forensic teams and verified as unaltered." Unaltered. I almost laughed at that word, though nothing about that moment deserved laughter. I knew exactly how unaltered that recording was. I had made sure of it myself, in the quiet hours after the rescue ship found me, when nobody was watching me closely enough to notice what I had actually done to that file. But that was a card I was not yet ready to show. The screen flickered, and the calm, ordinary interior of the Kestrel's bridge appeared, exactly as it had looked in the final hour before everything changed. I watched my own crew move across that familiar space, unaware that they were being recorded for a future none of them would live to see. I watched Grace laugh at something Peter said. I watched Olivia lean over a console, tracing a star path with one finger, already thinking 3 jumps ahead, the way she always did. I did not look away. I owed them that much at least. The Vasron ambassador raised a hand, and the recording paused on a frame of ordinary, undisturbed life. Around the chamber, 17 species waited to see what would come next, most of them already believing they knew. I knew too. I had lived it. But knowing what came next and being ready to watch it again were 2 very different things. "Before we continue," the ambassador said, his translated voice carrying easily across the silent chamber, "let the record show that the human witness has not yet spoken in his own defense. The Council extends him that opportunity once the recording is complete." I nodded once, because that was all I could manage, and because I had already decided something important. Whatever came next, whatever they showed this room full of strangers deciding my species' future, I would not defend myself with noise. I had spent 6 months turning that decision over in my mind, in a small, quiet cell aboard a rescue vessel, waiting for a hearing I always knew was coming. I would not shout. I would not plead. When my moment finally arrived, I intended to make it count in a way none of them would expect. The screen flickered back to life, and the sound returned with it. Ordinary voices from an ordinary day that was about to become the reason humanity might lose its place among the stars. I straightened my shoulders, kept my eyes open, and let the recording play. The recording moved forward, and I watched the last ordinary minutes of my crew's lives play out in front of a room that had already made up its mind about what those minutes meant. On the screen, Peter Lang was adjusting a sensor array, humming something tuneless under his breath. Grace Miller sat at the communications station, half turned toward the corridor, waiting for someone to bring her the tea she always asked for and never quite finished. Olivia Brooks stood near the main viewport, arms crossed, watching a slow drift of distant light, with the kind of patience that came from years spent among the stars. Then the alert sounded. It was a small sound, almost gentle, the kind of chime built to inform rather than alarm. On the recording, Olivia turned first. I remembered that moment clearly, because I had been standing only a few steps behind her, and I remembered thinking, in the space of half a second, that it was probably nothing. A debris field, a stray signal, something explainable. It was not nothing. 3 vessels appeared on the long-range display, moving with a precision that suggested they had already known exactly where we were. The recording captured Captain Daniel Shaw's voice, calm at first, requesting identification. There was no response. He requested it again. Still nothing. I watched my own face appear briefly at the edge of the frame, younger somehow, though it had only been 6 months. I watched myself reach for a communications panel, trying every frequency I knew, while around me the bridge grew quiet. In that particular way, a room grows quiet when everyone realizes, at the same moment, that something has gone very wrong. The Vasron ambassador allowed the recording to continue only a short while longer before raising a hand. The screen froze on a final frame, the 3 unidentified vessels closing in around the Kestrel like shadows gathering at the edge of a room. "The recording continues for some time after this point," the ambassador said, "but the Council has agreed that further detail is unnecessary for this hearing. What matters is the outcome. 11 crew, 1 survivor, no distress signal answered, no explanation offered." A murmur moved through the chamber, quiet but unmistakable, 17 species exchanging glances and gestures I did not yet know how to read. The Council's forensic teams have confirmed, the ambassador continued, that the vessels which approached the Kestrel that day carried configurations consistent with the Creole border fleet. When questioned, the Creole delegation offered the explanation that their vessels mistook the Kestrel for a hostile presence during a period of, and I quote, uncertainty regarding new species classification. I turned my head, slowly, and looked directly at Threx for the first time since the recording had ended. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply inclined his long, layered head slightly, as though acknowledging a fact rather than an accusation. The Creole delegation, the ambassador went on, has requested that the Council recognize this incident as falling under the protections granted to any species during what is termed a first contact uncertainty period. Under Council law, actions taken during such a period, however unfortunate, are not subject to standard accountability procedures. I felt something cold settle low in my chest. Not anger exactly, though anger was somewhere inside it. It felt more like the moment you realize a game has rules you were never told, rules written specifically to protect the person sitting across from you. In simple terms, the Alan delegate said, its small floating form rippling with motion as it spoke, its voice high and quick through my translator. The Creole are asking the Council to treat the loss of 10 human lives as a regrettable accident of misunderstanding, rather than as an act requiring consequence. That is a fair summary, the Vasran ambassador said. I almost spoke then. I nearly broke the promise I had made to myself. But I held it, because I understood, even in that moment, that raw anger was exactly what this room expected from me. Perhaps it was even what they hoped for, a reaction they could point to and say, see, this is what we were warned about. Threx spoke for the first time, and his voice, translated into flat and careful words, still carried an edge that no translation could fully soften. The Council should also consider, he said, the broader pattern this incident represents. Humanity is a species barely a decade into galactic awareness, and already it has been involved in 4 separate violent encounters. My own people deeply regret the loss of life aboard the Kestrel, but we must ask whether this pattern reflects unfortunate circumstance or whether it reflects something inherent to the species itself, a tendency toward conflict that other species do not share in equal measure. The words landed exactly the way he intended them to land, quiet and reasonable on the surface, poison underneath. I watched several delegates nod slightly. I watched the Vasran ambassador's mandibles click once, thoughtfully. I watched most of all how comfortable Threx looked while suggesting that my species was somehow responsible for its own losses. The human witness may respond, the ambassador said, turning toward me at last, though the Council reminds him that this hearing is not a trial in the traditional sense. There is no accused party here. There is only a pattern under review and a decision to be made regarding future protocol. No accused party. 10 people were gone, and there was no accused party. I held that thought carefully, the way you hold something sharp, aware of exactly how it could cut you if you let your grip slip. Before I respond, I said, keeping my voice level, I would ask the Council one question. Is it standard practice, when reviewing an incident of this nature, to allow the party whose vessels were directly involved to also propose the legal framework under which the incident is judged? A short silence followed. The Olan delegate rippled again, faster this time, in what I would later understand was mild alarm. That is an unusual question from a witness, the Vasran ambassador said carefully. It is a fair one, I said. I am simply trying to understand the process I am being asked to accept. Threx's long head tilted slightly, an almost imperceptible motion. The process, he said, exists to ensure fairness for all species, including new ones such as yours. I would not wish the human witness to mistake standard procedure for anything more troubling. I am not mistaking anything, I said. I am only listening carefully. I let that sit in the room for a moment, watching how it landed. Threx's expression, if it could be called that, did not change. But something in his stillness shifted, just slightly, the way water shifts right before it begins to move. "The council will now proceed to formal testimony," the Vasran ambassador said, perhaps eager to move past a moment that had grown less comfortable than expected. "The human witness will be given 30 standard intervals to respond to the incident and to the pattern it represents. Following this, the council will vote on the matter of containment protocol." 30 intervals. I did the rough calculation in my head, perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a little more. 30 seconds to answer for 10 lives, 3 hours of accusation, and a law written specifically to protect the very species responsible for what had happened. I looked once more toward the observer section near the top of the chamber, where that single faded flag hung in silence, marking humanity's place among the stars. Not a seat at the table, not yet. Then I looked back at Threx, whose stillness had returned, confident once more, certain that 30 seconds was nowhere near enough time for a single human to undo 3 hours of careful, comfortable lies. He was not entirely wrong about that. 30 seconds of argument would never be enough. But I had not spent the last 6 months preparing an argument. The chamber grew quiet in preparation for my testimony, and in that quiet, my mind went somewhere the recording had not shown. It went back to the actual hours after the 3 vessels closed in around the Kestrel, hours the council had decided were unnecessary for this hearing. I remembered Captain Shaw ordering all non-essential systems rerouted to communications, trying every open channel he knew, hoping someone, anyone, would answer and explain why 3 unmarked vessels had positioned themselves around an unarmed survey ship in neutral space. I remembered Grace Miller's steady voice repeating our identification codes over and over, calm even as her hands trembled slightly on the console. I remembered Olivia Brooks turning to me, quietly, away from the others, and saying that whatever happened next, someone should try to record everything, because data outlives people, and sometimes data is the only voice left to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. I did not fully understand what she meant in that moment. I understood it completely by the time the rescue ship found me, alone, in a ship that had once held 11 people I cared about. What the council's recording did not show, because I had made certain of it, was the final 90 seconds of transmission the Kestrel intercepted from the approaching vessels. Not a message meant for us, a private channel meant only for the Creel fleet itself, never intended for outside ears. I had heard it once, in the terrible clarity of those final minutes, before the recording equipment failed along with almost everything else aboard the ship. I had heard coordinates that meant nothing to me at the time. I had heard a designation that sounded, even through translation static, like a name repeated with unusual urgency. I had heard something that was not the language of confusion or mistaken identity, but the language of people executing a plan they had already agreed upon. I did not understand it then. I understood enough of it now to know it was not an accident. When the rescue crew found me, drifting in a ship gone mostly silent, I had very little strength and even less time before council authorities would take custody of everything aboard, including the flight recorder. So in those last private hours, using tools meant for calibrating old-fashioned communication equipment, tools Olivia herself had taught me to use because she trusted paper and patience over machines that could be tampered with, I did something no forensic scan was likely to notice. I took that final 90 seconds of intercepted Krill transmission and I folded it into the recording itself, hidden inside a frequency range far outside anything a standard council scan would think to isolate. Human hearing, especially human hearing sharpened by grief and by hours spent straining to catch a single word of explanation, notices patterns that automated systems are not built to expect. I built the hidden layer the way Olivia had taught me to read old star charts, by hand, patiently, trusting instinct as much as instruments. I did not know, sitting there in that rescue ship, whether it would ever matter. I only knew that if the council's forensic teams confirmed the recording as unaltered, as they just had, they had unknowingly confirmed something else along with it. They had confirmed that the truth was already sitting inside that file, waiting for someone patient enough and human enough to notice it. The Vasran ambassador's voice pulled me back into the present. "The Council recognizes that 30 intervals is a brief window," he said, "but this reflects standard procedure for witness testimony at this stage of review. The human witness may use this time as he sees fit." I felt every eye in that chamber settle on me at once. 17 species, each with their own history, their own losses, their own reasons to either sympathize with humanity or dismiss us entirely. I thought of every argument I had prepared during 6 months of quiet nights. I thought of citing treaty law, of presenting witness testimony about the character of my crew, of appealing to whatever sense of fairness existed within this ancient, complicated institution. I thought about all of it, and I looked again at Threx, who sat with the calm certainty of someone who had already won, because he understood something about this chamber that I was only beginning to understand myself. This was not truly a hearing about facts. If it were, 10 deaths and 1 survivor's testimony would have been more than enough to demand accountability. This was a hearing about comfort, about which explanation allowed the largest number of powerful, established species to feel the least disturbed. An explanation involving unfortunate misunderstanding disturbed no one. An explanation involving deliberate action would disturb almost everyone, because it would mean confronting something they preferred not to confront. Words, no matter how carefully chosen, no matter how legally precise, would not break through that kind of comfort. I had watched enough of this hearing already to understand that 30 seconds of passionate defense would simply be filed away as exactly the kind of emotional, unpredictable behavior the Vasron ambassador had opened this hearing by describing. If I gave them anger, they would call it proof. If I gave them grief, they would call it understandable but irrelevant. If I gave them argument, they would call it clever but unconvincing, because arguments can always be dismissed by those who control the rules under which arguments are judged. There was only one thing in that chamber that could not be dismissed so easily: the truth, buried where none of them thought to look, waiting inside a recording they themselves had already declared unaltered and complete. The Allen delegate's small floating form drifted slightly closer to the central platform, its voice carrying a note of what I would later understand was genuine curiosity rather than hostility. "The human witness has been very quiet since the recording concluded," it said. "Perhaps he requires additional time to prepare his response." "I do not require additional time," I said. Threx's stillness shifted again, just slightly, the way it had earlier when I asked my question about process. I understood now what that shift meant. It was not confidence faltering, it was confidence recalculating, trying to determine what kind of unfamiliar creature it was truly dealing with. I let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable, because silence, I had learned, unsettles people far more than they expect it to. In that stretched, waiting quiet, I thought once more of Olivia's words, that data outlives people, and sometimes data is the only voice left to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. I was not the only voice in that chamber. I simply needed to let the others finally be heard. The Vasron ambassador shifted in his seat, his patience visibly thinning. "The Council awaits the witness's testimony," he said. "The 30 intervals allotted have already begun." I felt the countdown as a physical pressure, though no visible clock marked it. I felt it in the stillness of Threx's posture, in the rippling anticipation of the Allen delegate, in the rows upon rows of alien eyes waiting to see whether the strange, quiet human would finally break into the kind of emotional display they had been warned to expect. I thought of Grace, humming over her console. I thought of Peter, tending a small green plant light years from any soil that could nourish it. I thought of Olivia, teaching me to read stars the old way, trusting instinct over easy answers. I thought of the 90 seconds hidden inside that recording, patient and silent, waiting for someone to simply point the room's attention in the right direction. 10 seconds passed, then 15. I could feel the chamber's collective expectation building toward whatever outburst they believed was coming, the outburst that would confirm every quiet assumption made about my species over the last 3 hours. I did not give them an outburst. I let the silence hold a moment longer, until even Threx's careful stillness betrayed the faintest trace of uncertainty, the first crack in an otherwise perfect composure. Then, with the full weight of the chamber's attention finally exactly where I needed it, I opened my mouth to speak. Ask the Creel. 3 words. That was all I gave them. After 3 hours of accusation. After a recording that showed my crew's final ordinary moments. After a law conveniently written to protect the very species responsible for what happened. 3 words, spoken quietly, without anger, without a single raised hand or raised voice. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. That earlier silence had been expectant, almost hungry, waiting for me to give them the outburst they had already decided to expect. This new silence was confusion, pure and total, spreading outward from the central platform like ripples across still water. The Olan delegate's small form stopped its constant rippling motion entirely, which I would later learn was itself a rare and significant thing. The Vasron ambassador's mandibles parted slightly, no click emerging from them at all, as though even his translator needed a moment to process something it had not been prepared for. And Threx, whose stillness had remained perfect through 3 hours of careful, comfortable argument, finally moved. Not much. A slight shift of his layered shoulders, a small tightening somewhere in that long, unreadable face. But I saw it, and more importantly, I saw several delegates around the chamber notice it as well. The witness's response is noted, the Vasron ambassador said, recovering some of his composure, though his voice carried a new uncertainty beneath its careful formality. However, the council requires clarification. What precisely is the witness suggesting by these words? I did not answer immediately. I let the question hang in the air, because I understood now that my silence had become more powerful than any explanation I could offer. Instead, I turned toward the central display, the same screen that had shown my crew's final ordinary moments only a short while before. I would ask the council, I said, to review the flight recorder once more. Specifically, I would ask your forensic teams to examine the full frequency range of the recording, not simply the portions selected for presentation today. The recording has already been verified as complete and unaltered, the Vasron ambassador said, though something in his tone had shifted from certainty toward caution. It has, I said. That is precisely why I am asking you to look again. A murmur spread through the chamber, quieter than before, but sharper somehow, carrying a different kind of energy. Threx rose slightly from his seated position, his voice cutting through the murmur with an edge that had not been there earlier. This is an unusual delay tactic, he said. The witness has been given his opportunity to respond. Further examination of already verified evidence seems an unnecessary use of the council's time. I looked at him directly, and for the first time since entering that chamber, I allowed myself something close to a small, calm smile. If the recording holds nothing further, I said, then a full examination will confirm exactly that, and cost the council only a few additional moments. I would ask what reason there could possibly be to avoid it. The Olan delegate's floating form began rippling again, quickly this time, in a pattern I now understood indicated genuine interest rather than nervous energy. The human raises a fair point, it said. If there is truly nothing further within the recording, a complete examination should resolve this matter swiftly and put the question to rest. The Vasron ambassador glanced briefly toward Threx, then back toward the central display, clearly weighing the political discomfort of appearing to protect one delegation's interests against the equally significant discomfort of appearing to obstruct a full and fair review. Very well, he said finally. The council's technical officers will conduct a complete frequency analysis of the recording in view of all present. Threx did not sit back down. He remained standing, his long body rigid in a way that no translator needed to interpret as anything other than tension. I object to this delay, he said, his voice rising slightly for the first time since I had entered the chamber. The witness offers no evidence, only suspicion dressed as procedure. If it is only suspicion, I said quietly, then the analysis will show nothing, and your position will be strengthened rather than weakened by allowing it. I watched something pass behind Threx's dark, layered eyes, something that looked, even to my unfamiliar human perception, remarkably like calculation. He was weighing options, deciding whether continued objection would draw more suspicion than simply allowing the examination to proceed. He chose, in the end, to sit back down, though his stillness had lost the perfect calm it carried when I first entered the chamber. Council technicians, small floating devices that resembled little more than drifting lights, moved toward the central display and began their work. I watched lines of unfamiliar symbols scroll rapidly across a secondary screen, watched the All-in delegate lean forward with visible curiosity, watched the Vosron ambassador's mandibles click in a slow, uncertain rhythm. Then the room went very quiet again, and this time even the technicians seemed to hesitate before proceeding. "There is additional data present within the recording," one of the technical officers announced, its voice carrying an odd, careful precision. "A frequency range outside standard forensic parameters, containing what appears to be a separate transmission embedded within the original file." The murmur that spread through the chamber this time was not confusion. It was recognition, the recognition of a room, realizing it had been shown only part of a story. "Play it," the Vosron ambassador said, his voice quieter now than it had been throughout the entire hearing. The hidden layer of the recording began, and though the words within it belonged to a language many delegates did not immediately understand, the Council's translators worked quickly to render it into something every species present could follow. Coordinates, a designation repeated with clear urgency. References to silencing witnesses, to closing distance before any distress signal could reach nearby monitoring stations, to completing what one voice within the transmission called, chillingly, the assignment. I did not need to understand every technical detail to understand the shape of what that hidden layer revealed. This had not been confusion, this had not been an accident born of uncertainty during a delicate period of new contact. This had been a plan, carried out with intention, and covered afterward with careful, comfortable words about misunderstanding. Threx rose again, faster this time, his voice sharp with an urgency that betrayed far more than his earlier composed objections ever had. "This is fabricated," he said, "a manipulation, planted by the witness himself to mislead this council." "If it is fabricated," I said calmly, "then your own technical experts will find evidence of tampering. I would welcome that examination as thoroughly as I welcome this one." The Vosron ambassador looked toward his technical officers, who were already conferring quietly among themselves, small lights flickering in patterns I could not read, but which clearly conveyed information to those who could. "The embedded transmission shows no signs of recent alteration consistent with fabrication," one of them finally reported. "The encoding method used to conceal it is unusual, relying on frequency ranges outside standard automated detection, but the transmission itself appears to be original data captured at the same time as the primary recording." I felt the weight of the chamber's attention shift entirely away from me and toward Threx, whose long, layered body had gone rigid in a way that no longer resembled calm at all. The witness could not have known to search for such a frequency without prior knowledge, the All-in delegate said slowly, its small form drifting toward the center of the room. "Which suggests he was aware of this transmission's existence at the time of the incident itself." "I said. "I heard part of it during the final minutes before the Kestrel systems failed. I did not fully understand it at the time. I understood enough to preserve it, in whatever way I could, for a moment, exactly like this one." The chamber had gone almost entirely silent now, save for the quiet, ongoing murmur of technical officers continuing their analysis, and the low, uneasy shifting of delegates, recalculating everything they had believed only minutes before. Threx remained standing, and for the first time since I had entered that chamber, he looked less like a confident ambassador and more like a creature suddenly aware that the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he had never anticipated. I had given the room 3 words. It had taken those 3 words, and the silence that framed them, to make an entire chamber finally listen to something that had been there all along, waiting patiently to be heard. The chamber that had spent 3 hours quietly deciding humanity's future now found itself deciding something far more urgent and far less comfortable. Guards, tall figures in pale ceremonial armor who had stood motionless along the chamber's edges since the hearing began, shifted for the first time, their attention no longer directed toward me, but toward the Creel delegation. The Vasran ambassador rose from his elevated seat, and though his composure had returned somewhat, his voice carried a gravity I had not heard from him before. The Council will suspend the containment review, pending a full investigation into this newly revealed transmission, he said. Ambassador Threx, you and your delegation will remain within Council custody until this matter is fully understood. Threx did not move toward the exits, though I suspected some part of him considered it. Instead, he straightened slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the smooth, comfortable confidence it carried earlier and replaced it with something sharper, more defensive. Whatever this transmission suggests, he said, it does not represent the will of my entire people. If individual officers acted outside sanctioned protocol, that failure belongs to them, not to the Creel as a whole. That distinction, the Allan delegate said, its small form now perfectly still, will require far more than a single statement to establish. The Council's investigators will need full access to your fleet's command records from the period surrounding the incident. I watched Threx's long face settle into something that was not quite defeat, but was no longer confidence either. Whatever came next for his people, the comfortable explanation he had offered at the start of this hearing was no longer available to him. The Vasran ambassador turned back toward me, and for the first time since I had entered the Great Chamber, his expression held something other than clinical formality. It held, unmistakably, curiosity. The Council extends its apology, he said, for the manner in which this hearing began. It is clear now that the incident aboard the Kestrel was not the product of misunderstanding, nor does it reflect any inherent pattern within your species. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I had been holding tightly since the moment I first stood on that black stone platform. There is a question the Council would like answered, the ambassador continued, though it is offered now with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. How did you know to search for a transmission hidden so carefully within your own recording? Our forensic teams did not anticipate such a method, and I confess, neither did I. I thought for a moment about how to answer that honestly, in a way that would make sense to a room full of species who processed sound and patterns so differently than I did. My people are not always the strongest, or the fastest, or the most advanced when we first arrive somewhere new, I said, but we have spent our entire history learning to recognize when something does not add up, when an explanation is too comfortable, too convenient, too eager to close a question rather than answer it. I did not know exactly what that hidden transmission contained when I preserved it. I only knew that the silence surrounding the Kestrel's final moments felt wrong, and that data, unlike memory, does not fade or bend to comfort. I trusted it to speak clearly, when the time came for someone to finally listen. The Allan delegate drifted closer, its small form rippling gently now in a pattern I understood instinctively as something like respect. A species that notices what others overlook, it said, and preserves truth patiently until it can finally be heard, seems an unusual thing to fear. Perhaps, the Vasran ambassador said, it is precisely the thing this council should have valued from the beginning, rather than reviewing for containment. A quiet ripple of agreement moved through several sections of the chamber, delegates who had sat silently through 3 hours of accusation now shifting visibly in their support. I understood, even in that moment, that this shift would not undo the loss of Grace, or Peter, or Olivia, or any of the others who never returned from that ordinary survey mission. No apology, however sincere, could restore what had already been taken, but it could, perhaps, ensure that their loss meant something beyond grief. It could ensure that the truth they died trying to record would finally matter to the very institution that had almost buried it under comfortable assumptions. The matter of containment protocol, the Vasran ambassador announced, addressing the full chamber now, rather than me alone, is hereby withdrawn from today's agenda. In its place, the Council will open formal proceedings regarding the Creel fleet's conduct during the incident aboard the Kestrel, and will further review whether existing first contact uncertainty protections require revision, given what has been revealed today. Threck said nothing further. He simply stood, flanked now by guards who had repositioned themselves with quiet, deliberate purpose, and allowed himself to be escorted from the chamber floor. I remained standing on that black stone platform a while longer, as delegates began speaking quietly among themselves, as technical officers continued their careful examination of the transmission I had hidden 6 months earlier, in a moment of grief and stubborn hope. I thought of Olivia's words once more, that data outlives people, and sometimes data is the only voice left to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. She had been right, in the end, though she never lived to see how right she truly was. The Vasran ambassador approached the edge of his shelf, looking down at me with an expression I finally recognized as something like genuine respect. Humanity has waited a long time for a true audience with this council, he said. Perhaps that audience begins today, though not in the manner either of us expected when this hearing opened. Perhaps, I said, it begins exactly the way it needed to. I looked once more toward the observer section near the top of the chamber, where that single faded flag still hung, marking humanity's place among the stars. It did not move, and neither did the section around it change in that moment. But something in the air of that chamber had shifted, quietly and permanently, the way truth shifts a room once it can no longer be ignored. I had entered the great chamber alone, prepared to defend my species with careful arguments I ultimately chose not to use. I left it instead having offered only 3 words, and a silence patient enough to let the truth speak for itself. It was, I would come to understand in the months that followed, exactly the kind of quiet, stubborn persistence that had always defined my people, long before any of us ever left our own small world to stand among the stars. We did not always shout the loudest, or move the fastest, or arrive with the most impressive show of strength. But we noticed, we remembered, and when the moment finally came, we made certain the truth could not be ignored any longer. As I walked out of that chamber, past rows of alien faces that now watched me with something closer to curiosity than suspicion, I allowed myself, for the first time in 6 long months, to simply breathe. The council had wanted to know what humanity was made of. They had their answer now, carried in 3 quiet words, and in the patient truth that had waited so long to be heard.